All right, good morning and welcome to the Game Dev Show. We're back finally, and we've got a full house and a lot of fun topics today.
Yeah.
So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us live and watching later. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up and all that and say hello in chat. And thank you all for being here. So we got Story, Harrison, Greg, and Powell today, and we're going to talk about a couple of interesting things. One is Harrison's book on design patterns, but I also think that it'll be an interesting tie-in to the discussions and debates that I've been watching on Twitter X with Casey and Bob, and I'm really hoping that they end up doing an actual debate live on video like they keep loosely talking about. I think it would be a lot of fun. So welcome. Thanks for joining us, everybody. And hello, guys. How's it going?
Hello, hello.
Doing good.
Hello, I'm doing pretty good.
Yeah, I'm good too.
stuff.
I just got out of contract in jail, so I've been working on some stuff for the last few months, and I just finally finished. So yesterday I got my free time back, so pretty good too.
You're free.
Oh, nice. Does that mean you're available for contract work now?
Sure. I mean, I hope you give me a week to work on some personal projects, but then, yeah, probably.
Right back in.
Got to get right back into it and keep hustling. Huh? So speaking of that, Harrison, let's start with your book real quick, because never mind, your internet is dead. Okay, we'll start with something other than Harrison's book and make sure that his internet doesn't die out first. I want to actually, the topic that I just mentioned a bit ago, I saw Jason, you kind of lit up when I started mentioning it. I assume you've been seeing that as well, the threads about whether or not object-oriented programming is the devil and nobody should have ever learned it, and it was a terrible idea to teach it in the first place, and that's the problem with all.
I mean, I do.
Obviously being way hyperbolic there, but there was definitely a debate on whether or not object-oriented programming is good at all and there are any benefits, and there was a kind of a back and forth. So yeah, you've been watching that? Has everybody else been watching it too?
No, where is this? I want to watch this.
This is on Twitter. I'll pull it up while Story shares his thoughts.
So there's been an ongoing feud with all of this stuff is cyclical, right? Like it's we have an era of object orientation, and then suddenly functional programming is the bee's knees, and then everything is back in cycles. And right now we're at the OOP is the old guard horrible way of doing things, and everyone is kind of decrying it as being pointless and bad for various reasons. And it's always the same cycle. So now Bob has gone from being, king of the mountain to everyone is now kind of looking at him as a silly old man who doesn't know what he's talking about. And so the new guard is you've got your Caseys and your Jonathan Blows, and it's just a constant back and forth of like, how should you do this, or is that right? Or it's always funny because it's the same conversations. It's basically it's the same thing.
Yeah, I think the I forget where the original post was, but they were talking about OO, and they said the original problem was teaching them that at all. I think it was on Casey's, but I don't know. I'm curious. I understand the reasoning and the thought behind it when you're heavy in a performance perspective, or when you're just thinking about the problems and issues that come, especially when junior level developers learn all kinds of cool patterns and techniques in object-oriented stuff. But I still don't understand why I'd love to see the debate is because I don't understand the argument when it comes to long-term projects that are constantly getting updated. That's where I've always seen the value of object-oriented separation become really valuable on things that are getting constant updates for 5-10 years, these long-running games and long-running applications. The value of abstracting stuff and adding these layers and things on stuff that's not going to change, that's going out once. It's going to be optimized, and it's probably not going to be modified much. It does disappear a lot, but I don't know when it comes to these bigger things. I feel like there's still a lot of value in it.
So this particular debate, it can be summed up, in my opinion, very simply with the idea that it's actually more of a FOSS versus enterprise argument, and I don't think people realize that's what they're actually having. Because what the real thing is a lot of the proponents of the kind of go faster and more efficient code are probably right, like objectively from a pure like information perspective. But the problem is they've never had to deal with having stakeholders that aren't them. And so a lot of the conversations come down to people who are making either open source software where people are okay with it breaking all the time, or people who are equally as enjoying fetishizing speed and min-maxing. But people who are building software for end clients and users who have to do fast turnarounds and also things like reliably keep the same thing. Like, for example, anyone who's ever worked at a large company knows that they're using 3-year-old, 10-year-old versions of operating systems, and they're not going to change because there's no reason to, and they don't want to risk modern stuff. And that would appall these people, the kind of idea that switching to new stuff. And so I totally get both sides of the argument, but I rarely see people discuss it in context, which is, you know, patterns and practices are slow. They do slow things down. They're very clunky, but they're a box set of solutions to a problem. It's like if you're working in a mess hall for an army trying to create meals for 1 million people or whatever, then your approach to solving problems is very different than if you're making the best burger you can, right? And I think people are just fundamentally assuming there's a right and wrong answer rather than looking at the use cases. And the fact of the matter is, things that have to break less often, or at least you're willing to pay for the kludge of the extra effort in order to have more modular pieces, so more disparate teams can work on different pieces at the same time, or there's more stakeholders and people are running on older versions. You need to have versioning of different stuff where you can swap out different component systems. That is a different set of use cases than make the best product you can. And I just think it's a different problem. And it seems a bit redundant to have people argue whether which is right or wrong. It's like saying, is it better to have a fork or a spoon? It's like you're not even talking about the same problems. It seems pointless to me.
Anybody else have a thought on that?
No, I agree with Jason.
Yeah.
So I just did a video on an old game that I wrote in '93, and I wrote it in C before I ever did any object-oriented programming. And so I worked in, you know, just procedural languages for probably 10 or 15 years before I started doing any object-oriented programming. And I just can't imagine ever going back to a non-object oriented language.
Yeah, I mean, again, people don't know the history, right? And a lot of this comes back to why does this stuff exist? And that's why, like, I've watched 50 hours of Bob talk about his opinions on it, and I've watched 30 hours of Casey talking about it. I wanted to hear earnest opinions on both sides. And the one that really stuck with me was when Bob was saying, look, in the early days, you deliver software on floppy disks, and the cost of having to repair an update or do a change was you would have to pay a guy to fly around the world and put a disk into different machines and update different systems. That is insane. So how do we solve that problem? Well, you invert dependencies and you build a system such that some system relies on another external component but doesn't know how it works. So you split out the interface, that is the contract portion, and then you have modules that can be set. That means the sizes can be smaller. You can possibly wire them over the air much simpler. There's lots of different solutions. You also don't have to recompile the app. So now you don't need someone who's a tech expert to rebuild and compile it on the local device. You can instead just send an update that drops a DLL into a directory, et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of these patterns are not arbitrary fun toys or ways to make code more complicated. At the time, they were a cost-saving measure to avoid having the huge cost of having to send out technical experts to solve a small problem of patching for a new piece of hardware or updating to a particular vendor's unique thing, which again was a bigger thing at the time. We didn't have these giant networks of interoperable REST APIs and stuff like that. It used to be they had a certain device for their payroll system, and you needed to have that particular set of commands or codes. And so you can look at it and say a lot of that stuff isn't relevant now. And sure, I agree. And there's reasons to argue both sides. But again, tools are used for certain purposes. And to say that a tool is bad because some of the same scenarios don't exist anymore, it just seems redundant to me.
What are the scenarios that do exist in your mind now? So you listed some that are kind of gone and dead or not really relevant because the internet basically.
The main one for me is business rules.
Simplest.
If I could pick one that I use every time and I will never not do object-oriented on, it's things like form validation or application validation or whatever. Because I say this all the time, is the unique part of your app isn't your UI, it isn't your database, it isn't any part of the thing that can be plugged in at any part of it. The part that makes your app unique if you were building like a to-do application, is the features. And the features exist in rules, which is if I do this thing, this occurs. Or if I have this and I add this to it, this can happen. Or you can add this to this. Those rules are irrespective of everything else. And they also have to be bulletproof and repeatable. And so a good object-oriented system can build the rules in its DLL that's like, this is my app. It has no front end, it has no back end, it is just the rules that define my application. And then you can deploy that and put an API on the front end of it, or you can put use it as a DLL in a desktop app or Unity app or whatever. And the ability to inject my particular platform's logging solution or my particular platform's handler for UI or whatever is just so useful. Like without going into all the micro details of using.
What's your gaming use?
For gaming, I think it's just more of a cognitive thing. I do think in performance scopes, in gaming scopes, I will say, again, we talked about this before. For me, I divide games into two parts. There's the loop-driven stuff, in which case I wouldn't use it as much. But then there's the actual rest of your application, which is basically a lot more than people appreciate. It is every menu, every system, every time you're doing rules for whether you're, buying things in a shop or saving systems out, your entire persistence layer. Like, how much of your app is your game's core running loop? Surprisingly little once you get into the weeds of like what's persistence, what's saving, what's rendering, what's UI, what's managing
like
state.
how much of the code and engineering work, right?
Yeah. And so a lot of that, why not just do an interface? No. So like one of them is for saving. Like I'll frequently in Unity in my projects, I'll have a quit. Quit will run a task, and a task will run an async operation. What am I going to do in that async operation? I don't know yet, but I'm using some kind of object I'll inject, which will basically do the has finished saving. And then I can have other systems that'll basically build a tree structure, and I can iterate the tree and grab my save data or do what I need to. And so a lot of the object-based stuff is perfect for me there because I can then build a composition route, which is actually something I want to talk about with other people because people get this one wrong all the time, bothers me, is I basically build an initial running method, which has a composition route, which chooses my configuration. So I can set which high score system I'm using or which save platform I'm using or whatever. And then my code can run and I can do really tight update loops and dots or whatever I want. But when it comes time to save, at the end of the day, it's just taking an in-memory object and dumping it to file. And yes, you can write that more efficiently and compress your bytes and write your own deflate or whatever. But the fact is, I still want that to be a choice. I want to be able to say, actually, I've changed my mind. I'm saving this out to JSON. Or actually, I have a friend who's building an app who's got an XML client, and I want to integrate with his XML client, even though he shouldn't be using XML. I can write 10 lines of code and make my code match his system, and it's very simple to just inject that. Or
it seems like you could do that in a functional setup too, though, couldn't you? Just by swapping out the system. Like the implementation.
You can do anything in either. Like the truth of the matter is, there's nothing. This is the point, right? There isn't one that you can't do. It's a question of what's easier and what's better for you. And from my perspective, I just think that if the goal is swapping things out, then object-oriented is better. And oftentimes for systems like that, it is. If your goal is more about the speed or about, and again, even comes down to cognitive complexity. A lot of people who do the functional approaches complain that object-oriented is confusing because it abstracts away the details, and I would argue that's a feature, not a bug. If you're doing something complex,
yeah, that's the point.
Yeah,
that's the entire point of this.
If you're doing like trying to learn an algorithm, I totally get why people are like, this is doing a complicated set of like this is using puts and disks. I always get the name of that wrong. It's basically doing the disk placement algorithm, and you're trying to find things. Maybe you do want to see every line of that in a row to make sure you're not doing some complicated algorithm or some cost whatever. But if you're doing a system that says can load stuff, start project, I don't care what load means. That is a fundamental part of my system. And I do the same with selection. When I write game stuff, I'll say can see something. If saw something, get stuff you saw. What does that mean? Depending on the project I'm working on for prototyping, it might be a raycast, it might be a spherical cast, I might be having a static list, it might be a hard-coded thing, whatever. I just write my code downstream, so I don't really care about it. So yeah, I think that's a silly argument in my opinion because it works either way. Like again, going back to this, I like what I like. People can use what they like. This isn't I don't care. I'm not like defending OOP. I'm just saying I use it. I think it's silly to say it's bad. Use whatever you prefer, and it's not the devil. It's just another tool. And if you prefer forks to spoons, then use them. I don't care. It doesn't affect me. I'm not going to get into an online debate to defend a hypothetical concept of an idea. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Right, well, like there's always
because you're totally wrong, Jason.
You're absolutely right. You guys ever read Ivar Jacobson's book from the '60s, the use case driven object oriented software engineering, where it's like how to make like software like comparable to like manufacturing back in the day, and it's basically goes from like the root of how object oriented programming was conceived. And
I don't
like,
think I've read it, but I think it's been referenced by Kent Beck in one of his books, and I'm like, why does that sound familiar? But I've not read it. It's like, yeah. So.
It's good, and I've been rereading it, and this is odd because it's like the same argument. Like you can use object oriented, like an object oriented language doesn't like make you an object oriented programmer. You can still do it poorly. You can still do it not at all. Like functional programming is the same, and it's like you're right. It's silly to think that because you choose a tool, you're automatically doing like using it correctly, because you're not. You could use C# all day and still not create an object-oriented application. Like that's entirely possible. And like the thing of being able to mix and match them, at least in like the .NET environment with like F# and C# playing together and doing like mixing and matching, like there's a clear, I don't know, that seems more of a clear message to me that like, hey, here are a bunch of tools. They can play well together. They can play in the same sandbox. Use them for the problem that you have and the correct problems that you have. Not assuming that like one is best for everything. So you're right. This is all new to me, this discussion, but I don't see how object-oriented programming could be a bad tool. Like it's like there's no bad dogs. There's only bad owners.
So
like,
I mean,
no bad.
Given that they don't have someone here to represent that, I'll happily steal man, because I totally get the other side of the argument. The core tenet of the other argument is to say that in a world that's become increasingly faster with technology that we're working with, we become complacent because we've been writing code where even though the scale of computer operations is kind of almost exponentially growing faster, code is seeming to get slower. Like broadly on scale, it's comical how slow opening Photoshop takes versus how Photoshop on Windows 95 took to open. And there's something very clearly wrong given the orders of magnitude of complexity of a system that's available. And there's some really interesting studies on the idea that the code base tends to replicate the structure of a code base tends to match the structure of an organization, because the organization represents how knowledge is transferred within a company, and then your projects will end up matching that based on how you've divvied up the different sub-teams and departments. And oftentimes in bigger companies, the more bloated a company gets, as a result, the more bloated a code base gets. And a lot of code is done where it's a lot of message sending that is kind of unnecessary for the actual core construct of the app. And then you get the whole concept of business value, where companies like Photoshop or Adobe are trying to build tools that have module injector type solutions. Again, Visual Studio is another one, where the app loads up 50 things before the app even starts. And now you're like, I haven't even decided what I want to do. Why is it slow to load when I haven't even opened up the core empty version of the app? And there's a lot of fair arguments that software direction is going wrong because of business, and it's a downstream effect. And OOP is an old guard concept, which sort of holds up this philosophy of business-oriented design rather than product-oriented design. And so the kind of pro side would say, we need better software. Better software is built from the ground up, as in what's the problem, write the code, minimal code required, efficiently, understanding the hardware you're on and writing it so it actually uses the benefits of the devices, like the memory and the structure, and understanding what SIMD is and how it structures your stuff. That's, again, fair argument, I think, because the world is getting worse software-wise relative to how it might have been if it was a simpler solution. My argument, though, is I think that's Nirvana argument, where it's very easy to say, if there was no big companies, if there was no profit incentive, if companies didn't require large numbers of people to build things, if there weren't 20 different vendors using the software with different version numbers who have different user requirements, who have different update schedules, then wouldn't it be better if we could just write really fast, small software? It's like, I agree. Yes, I do. That would be great, but it's not how things work. And people who have real problems to solve with big companies, and lots of people have to find ways around it. And whether you like the solutions that have come up with, I think the object-oriented approach and agile and all these other things are there to solve a very real problem. Would it be better if that problem didn't exist and everyone wrote super tiny, efficient code all the time? Yes. But if that worked perfectly, then Linux would be what users use as well as what servers use, but it isn't. And it isn't because that approach leads to stuff that's very powerful, but very hard to use and often not very user-friendly because it's fast and it's not designed with people in mind in a lot of cases. And I think that, so they're different products. And I'm not saying one is bad or good. I'm saying they're, back to the point, different products, different objectives. But yeah, so there is fair arguments on that side, I guess is my point. And the main one simply being, if you took all the arguments away and just asked the question, why is software slow now? Why is it when computers get faster, the software gets slower? That feels wrong at an intrinsic level. And it's a perfectly fair argument to say, let's try and solve that. And right now, OOP is the sort of the pig to slaughter on that particular argument. I didn't think I'd be the anti-OOP person on this one, but hey, someone has to take the role,
Yeah.
No, that was perfect. I was just going to ask you to do exactly that. Which is good. Right up until the end when you said that you didn't have an opinion on it. If you're going to steal mana, you got to fight for it. Tell them OOP is dead. But no, that was good. And I think that there's definitely really strong, valid arguments for really optimized stuff in functional programming in different scenarios. And really, I don't know. I feel like I'm starting to waver on this. Maybe next year will be the year where I'm just doing all functional stuff. We'll see. But before that happens, Harrison, you want to talk a little bit about your book?
Oh no, I'm
all
very much
object-oriented.
enjoying this. Since it only doesn't have any functional programming in it whatsoever. I'm so sorry. I feel like I prepared a report that was for the wrong class. I'm like, this isn't the one. I have a question though. So like, I don't do very much functional programming. From what you were talking about, Jason, like, is it not like, is it not as modularized? Is it not like as blocked out in terms of like what you can replace and like compose?
So without going into a whole big thing, so when functional isn't the other end of this, by the way, it's just one other option. But it's more a question of layers and abstraction. That's kind of the broad, like the antithetical thing. And the thing that people love about functional, the kind of functional's core tenet, is its state. So one of the reason why a lot of the patterns in object-oriented programming, again, you wrote the book on it, you know the idea, is state management at the end of the day. One way or another, you're dealing with either internal state or hiding state or sharing state or whatever. The promise of functional is everything is a single atomic unit, which is modeled off the concept of functions in math, where any consistent input gives you a consistent output. And rather than creating stuff like lists, every function is kind of like using link expressions, because they are like a functional approach, where you basically you do an operation that's a modifier that then returns another collection or another variation of the thing. And what that does is it leads you to have code which doesn't require as robust testing, because you don't have to branch on as many variations, because each unit is always doing a static single thing. And it means that each atomic piece is cleaner and simpler. And if you stack these pieces together, they're more reliable, it's easier to test with, and the actual logic is clearer to see in small bytes. And it's really useful for things that are very, again, math heavy, repeatable, rendering shapes, anything that's kind of got that structure to it. With the big trade-off being it's a lot of memory duplication, because literally in order to get that freedom, you need to be constantly cloning objects and modifying the way they work. Now, there's some. I was
going to say that sounds like a lot of memory overhead if you're going to have everything be static and not be mutable. Like,
which goes back to the point of like it's trade-offs all the way down, right? And then there's ideas of but there is other stuff too, like you get into reactive extensions and things, and it moves into like some of the benefits too is the way you approach information, in the same way that in general.net a lot of the like byte reading stuff or file operations would use stream patterns, and you'd use streams that would then modify a stream into other streams. That's a very big trope in functional, where the idea is that you would take objects, map them together, compress them into new objects, and you basically build a stream of data where you'd get multiple asynchronous sources, merge them together into new stuff, and you end up with this constant stream of like a structured unit of data that's always at the right time, at the right place, what you need it to be, and you're not having to deal with 5 or 6 different things. It's very elegant, and there's lots of really nice things in it, and it's why, again, I don't pick one or the other. If I'm doing builder patterns and I'm building something like stats, I like building stats functionally, because stats can always be comparable from an equality operator perspective. If I say, for example, someone with a shield of 30 shield, 20 health, and 50 armor, that should always be the same when I equally compare those two elements. And if I want to, I can say add 20 or multiply by 30%. I don't have to manage an internal state of that. I can return a new object, which is that modification applied with a new state object, and that equality will always be equal again, which means I could even use that as keys in dictionaries or other hash maps or whatever. So I find for like data-driven stuff, there's a lot of really powerful stuff in functional, specifically monads and how it handles, like, that's a whole different kind of ball game, but it's just another tool in your belt, right? Like it's another thing to learn.
All right, so then like if Link is already available and stuff we use in GameDev and Unity and whatnot, what's to stop us from using functional programming like in Unity, for example, with stats like you're saying? Is there a blocker?
Yeah, so there's nothing stopping you, but again, to steelman the other side, it would be like saying everyone knows the story of Null and how Null has destroyed so many projects and the famous quote of Null being the $1 billion mistake or whatever. It would be like saying, well, what stops you from just not using Null? And it's like, yeah, technically that's true in your C# applications, but unless you're using unless you're using one of the later versions, which lets you actually define things as non-nullable by default, it's very hard to do that. And your application structure is going to be mirrored by the design systems you're making. And so if you're writing in an object-oriented language, it's designed around that. And it's not that you can't do functional stuff, but the proponents are saying it should be functional first. And there are ways to do state in functional programming, but it's kind of like that's your edge case, not the other way around. You don't do a presumptive version of right that way. Yeah. So for example, F# is functional, and it's basically C# but functional.
Right, but like, so I made a course on F# and like the last part of it is like OOP in F# and it totally works and it's perfectly fine. But you're right, it's functional first. It's not meant to do that. That's like, oh, but you can if you want to have, object-oriented objects, go for it. Here's some internal state. Here's how you make, here's how you do all that. But it's functional first. So then if we did the opposite in C#, what does that look like? Like because that sounds real. All the things you're saying sound really good. Like functional is the only thing, or Link is the only functional thing I have experience with in C#. And
well, there are libraries out there. It's basically, there's libraries that give you things like more first-class monads or the ability to have option classes and things, which are a bit more kind of code by convention, where there's very structured systems you have to use and you're not allowed to do certain state modifications. Because again, you can always override these things in C#, right? You can create your own interfaces that force how equality works or force how you're using the indexers and things. And basically you just write your entities such that certain operations are disallowed or certain operations are allowed, or when you perform math operations on things, they manage them in such a way that avoids additional state generation, right? So there's lots of things. Although again, I do want to asterisk here. Well, I love talking about the functional comparison. To be clear on the argument, because if someone was to watch this and say they're not representing our argument correctly, that they don't. People who are against object-oriented are not pro-functional. That's not the argument. The argument is more the question of indirection is both slow and obfuscating. That's the kind of core tenet. And if you're these days, that leads to people having a less understanding of the core technology and result in worse code, worse programmers is also another argument that's often said. And the idea is that people don't understand what they're doing. And at a core level, even like, I think Casey makes a really good argument for it to do with layers of abstraction in an application. One of his quotes, I think it was Jonathan Blow actually was this one. He said specifically, how many calls does it take to send, I think, a couple bytes in Windows? And if you look at all the layers of functions and calls and operating systems and layers of abstractions, he said something like 1 million lines of code are ran before a single byte can be transferred in Windows. And like, I can kind of believe that given the sheer amount of like kernels and structures and whatever that goes on. And there's an argument to say, in an ideal world, if you're trying to send 3 bytes, you don't need Windows to do that, right? And so there's this whole like how much of this cruft is necessary. And so the real object-oriented leads to this idea of I build a system that's a black box and the black box spits out this and I do something else which accesses the output of the black box and repeats the process. But the problem being that if you just knew how the insides work, you could use it directly and you'd skip 17 layers of indirection. So if you could basically, if you didn't put a black box at every border, you'd be able to just talk directly to the data and you would do things faster. And the classic example of that being creating 6 objects which have int, age, and string health together is going to screw up your memory allocation because it's going to distribute them like in an inefficient way in memory versus having an array of ints, an array of strings, an array of whatever, which means you can leverage the fact that they're doing cache lookups and hits faster, right? So the point is that a lot of people don't understand this, and so they make decisions that are broad but don't understand the core stuff. So that's the real, like if someone was here to defend that point, that what they'd be saying is that if you should be making decisions based on how your architecture is running your code. And if you don't understand how your architecture is running your code, then adding abstraction layers is going to just make the overall system worse when you could be using the memory structures to your benefit and saving a lot of issues. But again, it's a question of goals and objectives.
Yeah.
Yeah, right tool for
I
the
don't
right
want to
job.
distract too much on that. But on your topic of just these abstraction layers, it is one of the things that often drives me crazy in bigger OOP projects where there's just layer on top of layer. It would be a simple call to something, and I've got to step, F12 through 5, 6 different layers to find out that it doesn't actually do anything at all, right? Or that it does something that's like a single built-in Unity call, but it's wrapped down layer after layer after layer, and everybody's calling it without even realizing what it's doing.
Or someone's imported a service where it's like
nuts.
You have a whole library and you're importing a whole lot of stuff, and it turns out they're basically doing like a custom version of Clamp, and it could have just been one line of code rather than injecting a whole library. Yeah. That does happen a lot. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. That kind of stuff drives me nuts. I would imagine it happens often in functional projects too, but not as much.
A good example is map, right? Like I use the map function a lot. It's so valuable to be able to take a number range and map it to a new number range. And I do have my own math utility library, but I found myself for ages trying to use it in every one of my little samples. And I'd have to go and send someone a script, and I'd be like, I have to send them my math library as well. And at which case I just got fed up and started including it as a function in these classes, because there's no harm in duplicating a line of code in places when I don't need an entire math library, when usually it's just me sending 1 or 2 functions. So being aware of this stuff and like breaking the rules here and there is perfectly fine if it serves your purpose.
Now, Corvallis, you just jumped in, so you haven't really had a chance to dive in on this. So you got some strong thoughts or any opinions on this object-oriented stuff? Should kill it all? Was it the worst thing you learned in school?
Down with both. Procedural for life. Aside from the meme answer, it is true. Right tool for the right job. And one interesting facet for functional, because I've had to start using and engaging with not necessarily functional as an archetype, but using bits and pieces of it in projects I've been working on for both work and hobbyist stuff I'm doing recently. Some languages are also better tuned for functional. So like optimizing that memory stack allocation for all that memory duplication. Some languages have a very, very big focus on actually being able to optimize this away, where I believe like in Haskell, for anyone who's ever touched Haskell, has a very efficient memory stack allocation. So you being able to do that memory duplication will result in way less actual total memory taken up, because it optimizes the way it's able to add, and it's able to call into other functions, as opposed to C# with just out the box naked C#. You're going to take more memory to do the exact same operation. But there are optimizations in like build flags you could even do in C# to give it that same level of optimization. So little bits and pieces for if you know you're going to approach a paradigm in a specific way, know what tool and what language you're also using for that specific job.
Interestingly, we had a short discussion right before the call went live too. I think is loosely related to this on kind of knowing the thing and knowing some of the intricacies. There was a update that Greg was doing for his newly released game. You want to tell everybody about that real quick, Greg, and about the technical thing that we all just kind of talked about and discovered before the call? I think it'd be useful for everybody building a Unity game at least.
Yeah, sure. So my math game was accepted by Legends of Learning. And then I got an email from them this week that they had translated it to Spanish, but they included in that email about 8 bug reports that their testers had uncovered. And they were all pretty minor, mostly cosmetic things. But I set about fixing those bugs. And then when I went to submit the update to Legends of Learning, it was rejected because it exceeded their 30 megabyte build limit. The uncompressed build size has to be under 30 megabytes. And I hadn't added any new content to the game. So I'm not really sure why it bloated my build by an extra 2 megabytes. But looking at the build report, I did notice that there were some Text Mesh Pro fonts that I didn't think I was using that were being included. I also went in and I shrunk down my texture sizes on a couple of textures. And I learned in this process that you want your texture resolutions to be powers of 2. That's something that I didn't take into consideration when I made
for the win. Yeah.
Yeah. But I eventually did get it down under 30 megabytes. And then I learned something new before the call today, that you can set the base font in your TextMesh Pro fonts to something other than their default Liberation Sans, and that way they won't pull in Liberation Sans by default.
And FYI, you can do the same with Pro Builder. If you're like me and you do Pro Builder and you're swapping out your base shape material, don't use the default one. There is a material swapper that you can like populate and do stuff, but you can also just go into the preferences and swap out the base material as well. And I do that so that it does use the right one each time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm getting a little bit of lag here, but Paolo, can you explain the power of two thing for everybody that might not know about it and understand yet? I didn't realize that wasn't a common knowledge thing, so I think it'd be useful.
Yeah. I think we should start that. It depends what you are doing. Yeah? Power of two textures are better compressed. That's the easiest said about those textures. Yeah. But your texture doesn't have to be power of two. You can always get them, take them into Atlas. So take different textures, put them into one texture that has the power of two. Yeah. For example, for UI elements and sprites, Unity can do it for you. I always prefer to do it by hand, especially for textures for the trees, the grounds, or something like that to have it better. There are also several tools that can make them take your different textures and take them into power of two. Yeah. And then, depending on the compression you're using, it sometimes is better to have one bigger texture than several small ones, because it can lead to smaller size of the texture. I think that's the most basic thing about it. Yeah, sometimes it's better to have 1024 than several like 256. If you're doing for example, Android devices that have worse compression than you're basically normally using. Yeah, because if you are doing for web, that's not a problem. That's mostly one type of compression that you can use. But if you're making for Android and you're making for different kinds of Android devices, you should be checking if you're using ASTC, ATC, and so on, and you should check which compression will give you the best value for the size by memory.
And for checking that, what's the best place to look? Do you use an external build tool? Do you just look at the build report? You look at the inspector there? Where do you find the best place to get that info?
Mostly check by building and checking on device. Yeah, I sometimes use tools like on Asset Store, that's build report tool that gives you quite nice info about it, but I always check then by on device how the device handles it and then what size of textures they will end up with. And I'm checking always two things. One thing is how big is the file size on device, and second, how big is the texture in memory after running it in the application. Yeah.
Okay.
I will say though,
this
is a prime example of kind of what that other side of the argument is saying, is that the reason for power of two being important is due to the fact that everyone knows, yeah, computer is binary, blah, blah, blah. But once you start moving off the chain, you're going binary to hex. Hex is still power of two. And then the reason why all of this matters is because you're talking about word lengths, and words being another name for, the length of your bytes. So the idea being that when you're, the visual metaphor I use is your computer is constantly talking to its different components. So you're talking between your processor and your graphics card. And imagine it's a truck with a certain number of slots in the back. And you can fill up the slots and you're driving back and forth with the valuable information. If your information is in a size that matches the quantity size of the truck, you can maximize your efficiency going back and forth by putting as much information forward and back as you can. If your stuff is not in a matching size, you'll always have one left over, or you'll have to have some empty slots, and you're wasting performance that's free on the table, providing it matches. And so the point with MIP mapping and similar is most graphic pipelines and things are sending their data in these 2s, 4s, 8s, 16s because of the way the structure works. And if you have something, even operations, when you're doing math operations, they're sent in those 4s or whatever, depending on what you're doing. And so if you have things which don't neatly line up, it's not the end of the world. It just means you have to wait for an entire other cycle to pass by, and nobody wants that. And so this is a lot of this stuff stuff comes down to almost everything in computers works better in powers of 2 because it literally matches the underlying memory structures.
Yeah.
And that's, again, one of the arguments why people are saying it's people need to know the underlying structures because it'll inform decision making higher up the chain.
Yeah, and that's also one important thing that we would add here, because power of 2 is only one side of it. Yeah, second side is bit size of each pixel in this power of 2 texture. Yeah, because you can have textures. Normally, I think we use 24 or 32 bit size textures. Yeah. It depends what you're doing. Yeah, but if you don't need this quality of texture, you should shrink it down with bit size. If you need to, for example, if you're using gray texture, you should use 8-bit or 16-bit texture only. You shouldn't have RGBA channels because it makes things worse. If you're not using alpha channel, then scrape it out of the texture, because then, for example, if the texture is changed into mid-maps, so the texture, when you're rendering it on 3D, Unity generates mid-maps. So lower quality texture depending on the distance of the texture. Yeah. Normally, if you have channel A, it's separate memory chunk that it has to save. If you don't have alpha channel in the texture, it stores it in the alpha channel. Yeah. So if you're not using alpha channel, don't use it. If you don't using green channel, don't use it. That's why, for example, if you are making some textures for ground or something, we are making masks. Yeah, one texture is for the albedo. In alpha channel, we are, if there is no alpha channel for transparency, we are adding, so for example, metallic texture or smoothness texture in there. The second mask is mask texture that can have on each channel different kind of data. Yeah. There are solutions, because, for example, normal map. Normal map is RGBA, but mostly you don't need the B channel. Yeah, the B channel can be generated on a fly in memory, in a graphic card, during the decompression of the texture. So you can have your normal maps with only R and G channels, and you can have the additional data on B and A channels if you know about it. You just have to remember that in the shader, you just take RNG channel and generate B on fly. Yeah, it makes your shader a little slower, but your memory size is shrunk by 1/3 of all your normal maps in your project. So if you're heavy on 3D graphics and a lot of textures, this shrinks your size of normal maps by 1/3. And you can have additional things like that. Yeah. So always, one thing is looking at the size of the texture. The second thing is looking, do I need this kind of bit size texture for what I'm doing? Yeah.
And there's other two parts of that too, is that there's not just compression at a basic level, which is sort of saying, can I squash relevant things together and kind of equate the information back? But there's also things called perceptual compression. And perceptual compression means not all compression is equal. You can have a lower quality image by just like stripping away amount of colors available. This thing technically has 500 shades of red, but actually if I only use 300, it'll look slightly worse. But here's the thing. We perceive different lights differently. We perceive different values differently. Our ability to detect edges is different. Like human beings are not an equal machine. The information we're processing is not equal. So smart compression algorithms choose the things that we're bad at perceiving and take the information out of there so it still looks pretty relevantly close to the original. And so you can do that as one way of getting more data across. The second one, which builds on what Paul was saying, is at the end of the day, when you send a texture to your graphics memory, you're basically just sending data, and textures are just a good way of doing that. There's another concept kind of past that, which is the idea of using bit compression. And so if you look at your image as simply a collection of individual color pixels, a color is, your RGB, you've got 256 potential value, 256 potential values per each one of those, then you could be sending all of your values. Like, imagine I was doing a tower defense game and I basically painted a square for each pixel that's either white or black. It's like, oh, that's a tower, that's not, whatever. That sounds very efficient. I'm like, I've just got one texture for each. But at the end of the day, if I've only got 10 possible towers, I don't need to store just one tower per color, because a color is actually 256 possible values, 266 values, 260 values. I could actually store multiple different towers in that one chunk of data if I don't think of it as a color, a single value, but I think of it as 3 collections of the number 0 to 256. And there's a lot of other stuff, and it's the whole thing of why you've got unsigned as well, and signed, which is basically halving your range on that too. Like, there's a lot of other really interesting stuff here. It just boils down to treating it as information. Like, what is your information passage, and how much information are you sending? And a lot of people end up sending a lot of redundant information. And if you pause and look at what you're sending, you realize you can squish a lot more of that down into a smaller kind of conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. That underlying knowledge and knowing your use case are by far the most important, because you can modify things accordingly. Like, I didn't realize you could generate a B channel on the fly. If you really don't need it and you're running into performance issues, find the ways you can optimize, because through just like the normal game engine or game development process, you're going to take things for granted that are waste that you don't need to do. Kind of synergize it with the paradigm conversation as well. If you're used to OOP, you're going to use that hammer for everything until you realize, do I need to use like mutation here? Do I need to allow like these layers of abstraction? Or could I actually axe that and go for a simpler, more optimized solution? If the user doesn't need to see the 4K texture, or they don't need every texture to be 4K, which is never a good use case, don't add in extra waste that you don't need. And when you're going back to optimize, you're wondering, why is my game running slower than it should? It's these tiny things that add up over time, and being able to acknowledge them and have some underlying knowledge as you program, you can help avoid stacking them up until you end up with undesirable runtimes of performance.
Yeah, like my favorite example of this of all time is the FLAC format, just because it's kind of so elegant. I bring this up a lot. So FLAC is the free lossless audio codec, and it's lossless as in you compress it with FLAC and you'll get back your original audio. Like, there's no loss of quality with FLAC as a format. And it's like, well, how do you remove information but get the exact same quality back? That's impossible. You can't remove stuff. It's like, well, actually you can, because if you understand the concept of audio and its waveforms, you realize that a waveform is, it's like if you throw a ball, or you, from a physics perspective, there's an arc. And in order for something to hit 3 points in that arc, it has to hit all the others to get like that perfect arc, right? So conceptually, you can store the information of that arc by only storing the start, the middle, and the end, and it'll have to be a certain shape to get through all of it. And so audio compression is the same way. It's like, I don't need to store every point of every possible value of the audio at every point in time. I need to store just enough that if I rerun this concept of the waveforms, it'll have to re-hit all the points. And so I can store vastly less data. And so that's what FLAC is. FLAC is basically saying, I'm not storing the full waveforms. I'm storing enough information that I can reconstitute that back as easy as possible and guarantee that it's lossless. So yeah, there's a lot of this stuff is just, again, it's interesting to understand how it works.
That's super cool.
Yeah, the second thing I would, third thing, I would also look what size of texture I need when I'm doing something. Yeah. So, for example, if I'm doing my base resolutions, for example, I'm doing on a phone. The base resolution of a phone I'm aiming is lower than devices with one full HD or HD resolution. I don't need 2K or 1K. Even 1K textures are too big for it, because 1K texture would mean that the entire screen is with this one single texture. If I have a character that size, the highest zoom I can make on it is about half of the size of the screen, that's, I would say, for the full HD, 1K texture is too much. I would go with 512 pixels for this character, and I would give it to, I think, 256 normal map. Yeah, I always get the normal map about half size of the texture I'm using, especially for mobile. Yeah, so check things like that. If you know this is terrain texture, for example, and terrain textures are tiled. You don't need to carry terrain texture if your screen is full HD. You don't, because if you use it as normal texture that you paint over terrain, you won't be seeing it the entire texture in your screen. Only if your player just goes down and sits at the glass, yeah, for example. So check how big is the same with the fonts. Yeah, we talked about TextMesh Pro. Check what is the biggest size of the font on your screen, how many pixels are that in your screen, and check what size of your atlas do you need to do it. Because
actually,
it's a lot.
Atlas for texture is another good example. I don't think people really know what SDF means, right? So
Yeah.
when you do it, if I was drawing text to a screen, how do I draw it? Well, it's an image, right? So I'm doing pixels, and so you could just write the pixels down for the letter S. But the problem is when we're talking about screen resolutions and scale, what if the pixels of my S don't line up with the pixels of my monitor? You get those weird misalignment offset things. And at different scales, as you start to scale up and down the text, it starts to get fuzzy. And you'll see this on some old machines where like the dot will move on the letter as you scale up and down, and it looks very off. So there's this concept of SDF, or signed distance fields, which sounds very complicated. But what it really means is instead of having a solid like cutoff line going, that's where the S stops and that's where the S starts, what if I treat it almost like a blur, where I basically gradiate out from like dark to light where the kind of color is. And then what you can do is you can redraw the shape effectively by using that extra distance as your depth. And so, yeah, that's a lot of that is there's different tech that does different solutions for this. And SDF is used in lots of things. It's not just for fonts. But whenever you see SDF in TextWorks Pro, for example, that's what you're doing. You're building an atlas where if you look at the atlas, if you zoom in, you've basically made fuzzy text. You've kind of like, you've added amount of buffer around the edge, which is how much extra like scale range this has to still stay sharp, because it has enough information to know how to draw comfortably around certain edge shapes.
Yeah. Buy yourself the room ahead of time.
Yeah. There you go, fuzzy shapes.
There you go.
Yeah. Yeah, this is exactly that.
Now, before I forget, I was sharing this build report tool that's on that flash sale, and I figured we should probably let everybody know that there is a flash sale, and there's something even more exciting than the flash. The flash sale looks cool. It's got 60% off of a bunch of stuff, including that build tool. But the thing that I thought was more exciting is the Publisher of the Week sale, because Powell's stuff is on there, and now you get some free nature manufacturer assets. If I can pop up that tab, looks like the Ice World is free this week.
Yeah, the Ice World is free.
And then all your other stuff is 50% off.
Yeah, all of our assets are 50% off. The Ice World is free for everyone with the, but remember to use the code, because we already had some people that didn't use the code and were trying to get the refunds. Yeah, if you forget to write the code, you write to Unity help and they will refund you, and you can use the code again. Yeah, but you have to go through Unity refund process.
Yeah, I wonder why they don't just make that automatic so that you don't have to put in the code.
Know.
People get confused by it all the time, like they're having to put the code in. It should just auto apply.
Yeah, for me too, but that's just.
I've had this happen with Humble Bundle as well, where sometimes I'll grab like a bunch of assets that are on Gumroad, but in order to actually redeem that, you add the asset, but it doesn't automatically add the 100% off bit because you already bought it on Humble Bundle. So you have to do that for each asset, and there's a cart limit. It is an act of torture to redeem all the assets, but I'm addicted to having assets, so we go through this masochistic dance.
It's funny being as like someone who's been on Humble Bundle back when they used to have one Humble Bundle and no shop, and watching how as they scaled up, trying to solve the problem of, oh God, now we're giving people 50 things across 6 stores, and they tried so many different variations and solutions of redeeming. Sometimes you had to go to like second websites. Sometimes there was like third types of keys. And now they have it locked, like a pretty well done. They've got their own inbuilt store. You've got your free versions there. You've got the external stuff, and there's a one-click solution for Steam. But that used to not be there, and you'd have to do this whole roundabout thing to get Steam games unlocked. It was so tedious.
Yeah, it was problematic back then.
How much effort are you going to go through for a good deal? And the answer is a lot.
Yes, I'll put 10 times the effort as required just to get
all of it.
50% off, 100% more work. I like those odds.
Maximum
well, a Humble Bundle, it's like 95% off.
True. Okay, that's not even an understatement.
No, word of warning to anybody who is like a Humble Bundle addict. I do like them; they're great. But if you have been collecting them for 6 years, you'll start to notice you're buying the same things again.
Yes.
A lot of the time, they have a lot of the audio packs, for example. They work with like 4 different publishers, and you'll get a lot of the exact same audio packs if you're not paying attention. So just make sure you're not buying too much of the same thing.
You don't have to wait till 6 years. Give it about 2, and you will start to see some duplicates. Sometimes it will be another piece in the exact same series, So for instance, this is like Apocalypse Weapon 1, but there are 6 volumes of that. So this time, no, it's Apocalypse Weapons 3 on a different marketplace that you have to then try to synergize when you port that over to Epic or Unity. And now I'm back on the marketplace and I'm looking at tanks. This isn't good for my wallet. What are we talking about?
Talking about the flash sale.
Oh,
Talking about driving some tanks over your free ice world. Oh man!
Right now.
So I want to derail a little bit, but I wanted to just briefly go back to design pattern things. We have a guy who wrote the book on it here. I just love being able to say that. That's such a satisfying statement.
I know. I wanted to share his book real quick too. Everybody hasn't checked it out. There's a link. Go grab it on Amazon, and I think we'll probably be discussing it multiple times throughout the next couple episodes. I'd love to do. I didn't mean to cut you off, sorry, but I'd love to do some actual episodes where we just like read through a single chapter together and then just discuss it and tear Harrison apart on live stream. I think it would be a lot of fun.
How it gets better.
Yeah, I was just going to say that because I watched your interview last time with Jason. You were talking about patterns, and I was just marveling because it's a lot of the same story. I find it funny because trying to teach design patterns to people is always a struggle, because a lot of the problems with them are they're solutions to problems you haven't had yet, and until you have hit those problems, how do you teach someone that they're going to need it? It's like I always go back to things like trying to teach a doctor to wash their hands. Like obviously now it makes perfect sense, but if you could, the whole classic going back in time story of like, why would I do that? I'm not having a problem with that. I said, well, actually you're killing patients because, the cross-contamination. But if you don't know that's a problem, then you don't know it's a solution. And a lot of design patterns are to avoid you tying yourself in knots later. Now, there's also, like anything, you can overuse it. And the problem is they're fun. Like every toy, once you start playing with it, you'll overuse it. But I wanted to bring it up just because I was kind of laughing along going, when people ask, why should I use X pattern or Y? That's always a real struggle to find a good answer to, because the answer is like, walk with me through this problem. And when you hit this wall and you don't have a good solution, here's why it helps. But like, you have to get far enough in, and people aren't usually listening that long to get to the problem,
Yeah, no, that was coming up with the examples that were simple enough to get people to wrap their head, like that were bite-sized enough, but that were complex enough, was actually kind of harder than all the testing and the research.
It's your pizza shops. That's the answer, right? Pizza shops and ducks. They're all the way down. That's the.
Yeah, right. It's always make cars, make pizza, which it's fine, but like that was one of the harder parts, because I try to think of, because I mean it is focused towards games, but it like 95% of the book you could use in vanilla C# in .NET. You don't need Unity. But like, yeah, that was really hard. But the game dev stuff, I tried to think in terms of mechanics, because mechanics, at least for learning and for people that will be drawn to like game specific learning, is easier to wrap your head around and then go back and be like, oh, I see the concept now behind how this mechanic is working. So we're doing it kind of backwards.
Well, that's why I totally agree. Like that's what I've obviously sat and thought about a lot of these problems too. And one of them that blows my mind is the fact that if you were to kind of rate complexity of design patterns, command pattern is like probably the simplest by a relatively large margin. But despite that, it's also the one I think is most misunderstood, or at least very highly up there. And I've been constantly struggling to try to find that explainer that's very much a eureka moment. For me, I think the answer lies in constructors. If I can get people to understand the difference between the having to use arguments versus using a constructor to like remove the need for that dependency on the type when you're using it, is if I can get people to really lock that in, it's that philosophy of like, this is now interchangeable elsewhere and stuff. That to me, I think the answer is in there somewhere, but it's very hard to get people to understand, because I keep seeing people try to follow command patterns without really understanding it, and end up having to make variations where it's either T generic execute commands or creating 7 commands for different entity types, and then not really getting the benefit of being able to stack them into the same command manager, or not be able to undo them.
That's not gonna help you. You're just you just got fluff. Then you're not optimizing for that. But like, you're right. Try explaining to that before they've run into this, like before they've run into like having to do an unending undo chain of actions. They're like, oh, well, now I have a problem. Now I have a serious problem. And how do I do this? Like, even in a simple game, that could be a big help.
Yeah, and I don't like to throw too much shade, but one that drives me insane is if you follow Unity and research architecture for any length of time, you'll eventually come across the talk that talks about scriptable objects and everyone, how amazing they are. Now, again, it's a great talk and it's a great bit of advice, but I watched that the whole time and said, yeah, this is the mediator pattern. It's like it's a lot of extra words to describe the mediator pattern, and it's in the framework of Unity, which is useful to know. But a lot of people watch that as if they're like, oh my God, this is the best thing in the world. It's like, yeah, but it's one of the patterns in a book of patterns that's 1 million years old. It's like, it's such a fundamental, if you understand the fundamental structures, it is cool to see this version of it. I hadn't even thought of that implementation the first time I saw it, but it wasn't like game changing from my perspective. But a lot of people, it's such a big deal that it's like, yeah, but if you go back and learn pattern stuff properly, that won't be as shocking for you. A lot of that stuff is simpler.
But that's the thing. Like, I think that GameDev leaves that out more and more as we go farther and farther into engine development. Like when I was in college, I was in game development, and I only had to take like one beginner class, and then it was like engine scripting. It wasn't like system architecture. It wasn't data structures and algorithms. It wasn't design patterns. It was how to work in Unity, how to work in Unreal. And then this whole, like, a whole chunk of competence gets missed until you get into your real job, and you're like, oh, that this would have really helped. And this goes back to the, like, separating out the OOP and your runtime loop, like as like being reusable, and like splitting those two things in terms of like how useful OOP is in Unity, because it is, if you split, like Jason said, if you split your game, which you obviously should, into business rules, business logic, whatever you're doing, you're like domain driven, or however you're structuring your business part of your code, and then the fun Unity stuff that handles the loop. And
not to mention UI stuff, right? You've got like UI stacks. Like the fact that one of the coolest patterns I ever learned when I was younger was the idea that if you're doing UI and you want to have modal windows over the top, you've got to deal with, like, how do I manage state of like mouse controls and who gets the input and make sure the other things don't do it wrong. It's like, well, that's literally just a command stack. Like you do a stack of different windows and you pop and push the ones you need. Or and there's tons of examples of this. Another one too is there's like the non-standard patterns, which are really useful for things that you don't think about. A good example is input boxes. The amount of times I've seen people do an input box where they're just like, oh, I want to do an input box and then do a search against something and return the results, but I don't want it to be a button. I want to like automatically do it. But when I do, I keep like spamming every time I change a letter, and then I have to like reload the database. So it's like, yeah, the name of that's debouncing. There's a name for it. It's a thing you can apply. There's a pattern you apply and it solves that problem. Tons of these have like named patterns, if you understand. And they're not all patterns in the object-oriented sense of a big dramatic arc, UML diagram, but there's just the original impetus for the book. It's written in like the first or second page. There are a bunch of named solutions to known problems. They're just things people have found and given names to. It's not prescriptive. It's descriptive of what's already there. And so the world is full of these people who've solved problems and given them names, and you can just take the name and use it in your thing. And not word for word, you can just apply it as you need to. And I think that's kind of one of the things, is teaching people what they are and how they work gives them the power to go, I'll take the bits of this I like, or that's useful to what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, that's a big thing. No, go ahead.
Just how someone also comes across the idea of like design patterns is interesting. Kind of something like what Tailwind had mentioned. When you're like a beginner and you first start, you just have an entirely blank canvas, and you're like, okay, well, let me just like start working. And you're just going to start creating systems and coding until you run into the problem. And that's where I think that critical inflection point is, where now someone can tell you about the problem. So like even like a data structures and algos course, you can understand the idea of like big O of n, or like runtime logarithms, or even specific ways to handle manipulation if you go to like leak code for arrays and such. But none of this feels super real. And this is how you end up in kind of an over academic engagement with software engineering, where, oh yes, I know the exact answer to like this hard leak code problem, but you have no acknowledgement of what this looks like in the real world until you've been building. You've built out your game system. You now have a character. You have like an RPG system. And oh no, now I have debouncing as a problem. I just wanted to create a search box, but now built on top of a castle of my own code that I now know, I see the problem, and the problem has become real, but you don't have a name for it or a word for it. So you kind of start to script or like search, why is like my text inefficient? And gathering the language in order to build into it is important, but that's like the critical point that someone needs to find Jason's book. That's the perfect moment. Did I say Jason's book? I think I misspoke there. I have to back up.
It's my book, but it's all good. It's Jason's show.
Okay. Sorry, Harrison. This is the perfect time to find Harrison's book because now the problem is real and this gives words to the problem. And that's the addictive part of learning because now it's like, okay, someone else knows exactly what I'm talking about. They have experienced it at a different time and is now one to one.
Yeah, you're not alone. It's like naming your not unknown illness that you've been suffering for 6 months. You thought you were the only person to ever have this pain, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm part of 10,000 people that have this, and they're suing someone. This is great. I'm not alone.
Literally. Hell yeah. And now you can have that curated. You have that information. And I think that's where like the best form of learning really comes from. It is that try, fail, but then ask, why did you just fail? And then you can start building up a better system of, okay, now I know why I failed. Now I know where to look in the future to be able to build that connection. And that's something that I think a lot of engineers, when they start going through it, either you get super into siloing your own failures where you figured out what a pattern was without ever knowing the name of the pattern because you didn't look it up, you just brute forced it. And now, okay, yeah, I have the solution, you kind of implemented it, or you try to start engorging on knowledge and engorging on information without any of that real world practical. You need some of that direct feeling of what the problem looks like and how to actually solve it.
And also, like, to be clear too, it's not about intelligence or about right or wrong, because one thing that fascinates me is game development and enterprise development are fundamentally different beasts in terms of how you approach problem solving. And what's funny to me is I now see it, and it drove me insane. I'm thinking of working on another video, and the idea that I'm thinking about is, if I could have one thing I could go back in time and tell myself before I opened Unity, what would it be? And I finally found the answer that's like very clear to me, is the number one problem I see people who come from enterprise into game dev have is the struggle with the component model and architecture. That most game engines use some variation of it. And the answer is, like, why is that a struggle? And I realized the answer is that 90% of software you write outside of game dev has an entry point. It has a main.java, it has a program.cs, it has a app.js. It's got some file which is like, that's my first line of code. And I could query a million Unity devs and say, what's the first line of code you wrote that gets run in your application? And they don't know. And for people who come from an enterprise background, that's firm footing. I need to know where my like composition root is and my bootstrapping is. And I spent so much of my time fighting Unity and trying to understand, because even though I understood the pattern, I couldn't figure out where do I put the stuff that's meant to always be alive or meant to like manage certain cases. And I kept fighting this idea of like, do I have a scene that's like loaded every time? Do I have a prefab? Do I make a prefab, put it in every scene and delete the one that's duplicated? There's like a million of these hack solutions to solve things. If I could go back in time and tell myself one thing, it would be runtime initialize unload, print hello world there. That's your start point. And once I had that, I was like, oh, I'm back in firm foundations. I now know how to build my own, like I can instantiate, use the resources to instantiate an object. So my awake function becomes the equivalent of my constructor. So I can build services. So now I can build a service locator and I can register to it. And now on each scene, I can register each subsequent scene as a like context handler. And now I've got my local scope. And suddenly all of my old tools aren't like on the floor lost anymore because I have a frame of reference. And I can still leverage the benefits that component models give me, but I now understand how both tie together. And so I think even people who know this stuff coming from the other direction can get lost because the philosophies are different. And don't get me started on delta time. Like you never deal with that in enterprise. And so you're sitting there going, first you don't use it at all. And then you learn you should use it. So then you put it on everything and you're not thinking about what it means. And it's not until you sit back once and do the research and go, oh, it just means any number multiplied by this equals 1 every second or whatever. Like it matches it. Once you understand it's not that complicated, it's like, oh, now I know when and why I should use it. But these concepts are like, it's not about intelligence one side or the other. It's that wherever you dive in, you'll be entrenched in a certain set of rules, beliefs, and systems, and the other side will be wildly foreign to you.
And this is also why I highly recommend for starting with enterprise and you want to go to game dev, or game dev you want to branch out. Try those different frameworks early, and oh, it'll be so nice. Breaking out of that sandbox and learning to play with a different set of tools. And now you're more proficient with the concept of software engineering, computer science than I am just a like Unity dev, or I am just a React dev, or I'm just an enterprise dev. Because it's all code at the end of the day. Very different kind of starting principles and philosophies. But if you can learn to change your context, it becomes really enjoyable to be able to walk into a new set. It's like, okay, what set of boots am I putting on today? How should I walk through this problem? And then it starts to feel more and more familiar the more you walk through it.
Yeah, because the like not knowing what's going to happen or not knowing the immediate context it's not scary anymore, because you know how the bigger picture fits or should fit together, and that's your core competency.
Oh, it was a very good advice and a good discussion. I don't know where to go from here. Anybody got thoughts?
A bit that was in the title, or I think the thumbnail, was forums, and I did.
Yes.
I have
I was hoping your eye would show up too, because I figured your eye might have some really strong opinions. But have you all been watching what's up with the forums?
So I have a funny story for it because it made me re-engage with it. So I saw your eyes mentioning of what they were going to do with the forums, and I'm like, oh, that seems like kind of weird, but okay, I'm just working on something else. And then I have a friend.
You should explain that before you said what they're doing. Explain that for the before you.
Yeah,
what are they
everybody
doing?
who doesn't know what's happened.
Good call. So, for the best of my knowledge, which is again kind of in and out, I've been a little distracted over the past couple months. I believe Unity sunsetting their original frame web stack for their forum. So before it was hosted in one way, which caused a lot of forums to disappear. They're all moving to their new forum system, which is nice, elegant. It's wonderful to look at. But the announcement of the sunsetting was kind of sudden, and a lot of knowledge and like use case and information was on the previous web stack, and now that's gone. It's just gone.
Oh.
And it was a very, my use cases literally. I had a friend who asked me, "Hey, how do I make a new organization with Unity version control, which was previously called Plastic SEM?" Because I've done a game jam with this friend. I showed him, yeah, here's how you set up like a repo. Here's how you do your source control and everything. So now he's running his own game jam, and he's like, okay, how do I do this part? I'm like, oh, okay, sure. I look it up, and I realize, okay, well, Unity's now like owns Plastic, so they have a new dashboard for it. Okay, that's kind of interesting. And then I try to search the question, how do I make a new organization in Unity version control system? And I found quite a few forum posts asking about this. Oops, this forum's not available. Oops, this forum's not available. Oops, oops, oops. Like 10 plus links on my front page just do not work. And now it sets in for me the same idea of, oh yeah, I knew about it, but that seems like kind of bad, but it's not that bad. The feeling of when you're searching for something, you see your question in front of you in a forum post. Oops, that's no longer available.
Yeah,
I
feel like I can't give a fair response on this because I'm so guilty of this, and I have to apologize to people all the time. The amount of times people will DM me and say, "Hey, I wanted to link to that article you wrote a while back," and I'm like, that annoyed me. I deleted it a while back, and it's like, or I'm so bad for this. At one stage, I was trying to tidy up my Discord, and I removed a lot of channels, just made newer ones. And people were like, there was so much pinned stuff there, and I'm like, oh crap, I'm sorry. Like, and Discord doesn't let you pull that back, by the way. So there's like once you deleted it, you're gone. So now, whenever I sunset something now, I do -old and hide it so that it doesn't show up, but I keep it there just on the off chance. But yeah, it's I admit I'm very guilty of that. It's very easy to forget that people are actually going to be coming back to this far later and have their own use cases that aren't yours.
It's crazy too, because it can be a massive like year plus long legacy where this like 5-question forum post 3+ years ago now has a new question that someone can ask because it's relevant, because now that concept comes up. And this is generally an issue. I'm not envious of this issue as well, because it's the issue of infinite legacy. If I made something in a really like terrible way, but now so many people use it, I can never sunset it without like crashing an entire ecosystem. And I get that, yeah, by doing that, they have kind of crashed a lot of the forum question asking ecosystem. And as a spoiler for the story, I eventually found my answer. It tucked away in a singular one of their instruction manuals in a section that wasn't even labeled for Unity version control. It's under Unity organizations, which is you can only have them one-to-one. One Unity organization is one version control organization. These are now made to be inseparable, even though this wasn't always the case. And in my count, this isn't the case because I used Plastic before Unity bought it. So I have way more Plastic organizations than I do Unity ones. So now if I need to make a new one, I have to make a new Unity one. And there's a headache in regards to like even assigning assets. All of that's a bit bogged down just to say, yeah, the forum posting thing is a very big feels bad.
I will say though, my hot take is I still think it's probably the right idea for one main reason only, which is right now, anybody who's been using Unity for the last 4 years has probably long forgotten, but Boo or JavaScript, and not C# but renamed, used to be a very big part of Unity's development. And the big one, the one that I think is the number one change people forget, is everything used to be presumptive on dot syntax, which was just magically calling get component for you. So dot rigid body, dot audio, dot whatever. And all it did was call get component for you on some component. And when they completely removed that feature, every single YouTube tutorial, every single document or article that was previously recommending this, all of them are now out of date. And if that stuff had been kept around, the amount of legacy incorrect false information would be, untenable to deal with. And a lot of that stuff, if you leave it too long, people will hold on to it. And Unity, for all its faults and pros or whatever, it does change so often that a lot of old stuff is factually wrong now. And while you might find the article if you dig hard enough, you will then be even more frustrated when you realize that it's talking about something that hasn't existed for a year. So I would rather a world where I click links and they're not there than I click links, follow the guide, and then realize these aren't even the same words on the screen as the words on my screen. This is infuriating. I feel even more lost than I was before. So it is contentious, but I think back now, and I think the switch to forcing people to think of only using C# instead of JavaScript was such a boon to asset store developers, not having to deal with crossing information between the two different versions, simplified stuff. Like I think the downstream effects are so much better that it's if I could trust Unity were going to deliver and replace all that content, I'd be happy. But that's the only real worry, is I don't think they are going to replace a lot of this information that disappears. That's the real kind of crux.
For the record, I just went and searched for some of my old posts, and stuff from 2-3 years ago is there, and it says their migration has been completed. So I think they did migrate a lot of those old posts over to the new forums.
They did get enough pushback. They decided to migrate that stuff over and tag it. So it is there now, but that was originally not going to be the case.
No, I've got some good news and bad news here. For good for Corvallis, bad for Story. But I've actually talked to the people doing the forum stuff last week, and their plan is actually to have everything migrated over. And it's actually, from what I understand, it is all migrated over. They've just been running into issues with the redirect links. And I think what happened, I'm not 100% sure, is that the way that the links worked changed throughout the years, and they caught the redirects on a lot of them, but not all of them. But they're actually, from what I understand, bringing over all of the old content into this new system.
I will comment and now say I must retract that previous statement, because I Googled the exact same links that were broken and now they're working. This was literally a 2 day ago to today event. So I think
it was about 2 days ago they were dealing with these redirect issues where they had missed some different URL setups. So bad for Story, but good for Corvallis.
They got on that real quick.
Clap to them, okay? That was fixed 2 days when I encountered the problem. Impressive. On the other hand, I do totally vibe with what you said, Story. The infinite legacy issue, because now it's not even just legacy people use. It's now arguably harmful legacy, because it's for things that don't exist anymore, or for issues that are no longer, let's say, in a relevant context. The hope would be, because I don't think Unity locks threads, no matter how old they are, which again causes its own issues of necroing. But the hope is that usually someone will come by in the forum and say, "Hey, this doesn't work anymore." Like 2 years later,
oh yeah, don't get me started. Like I was asked, so I've been doing YouTube content of some description for like 5 years now or something, and I've been asked my opinion on something, and I've said it, and I'm still getting random comments that like necro the thread back up and go, well, actually, did you know? It's like, yeah, that arrived 2 years after I made that comment. It changes my opinion now. Obviously, I can't edit the video to go back in time and tell myself something different. But at the time, I believe that. Now I believe something else. There's new things that are different. It's just infuriating. Yeah.
Videos are super hard, because especially it's as a very microcosm. Let's say you made an informational video and you got one detail wrong. That was wrong a week later. There's no way to modify that. The video exists as the state that you put it out. So pinned comment, if someone reads comments, spoiler that most of the people who watch your video don't go into the comments, it's hard. Like, it's fixed and immutable, and now that mistake is there forever unless you completely remove the video, and most people don't want to do that, only if it's really egregious. At least with a forum post, the necroing can at least add to the content of, if you're already reading the forum, you should probably read it to at least the end of the solution. If it doesn't work, someone says, hey, this doesn't work, this is the new way to do it, and then that can be the end of it. But yeah, I'm happy it's there, but maybe a curation on things that no longer work, but that would also be a monumental effort. There's not really a good answer there. Like, the baggage legacy at least allows people to hopefully curate that a bit better. And I'd say it's as a, like, let's say just a PR standpoint, having that large ecosystem is a big plus of Unity. You know, if you're asking a question, there's probably a forum post with some communication on it. That's a very nice feeling of, I'm using Unity, I can look this up, as opposed to Unreal forums, which are getting better. I'll give them credit. They are getting better at having that, but aren't quite at that ecosystem level yet. Or Godot, which I can't speak to because I don't have direct experience Godoting forum questions.
Yeah. Now, I want to, before we start to run out of time, there's something important that came up that I just remembered that I kind of want to talk about. And this question Dustin asked reminded me of it. And he's talking about how we were talking about Pro Builder before and how terrible it was. And he was shocked that it's as bad as everybody else said. I mean, I think you mentioned story that everybody, tried it out and was like, oh, I'm going to go try this out. And everybody, independently came back and said, what the hell? But on the topic of Unity 6 and future stuff in Unity, I'm really curious what people would be actually looking for and interested in. Like, what would make Unity 6 exciting enough for you to care about upgrading? And is there something in there right now that already has you that excited? Or in future versions that's coming? Is there some major thing that would definitely make you upgrade? And this is taking into account that whatever game you make is going to make 2.5% less now.
MPPM, not having the splash screen.
Are those worth 2.5%?
No.
The only thing for me, the one and only thing would be the iteration time on developing anything. The way Unity is designed, such that everything requires a constant recompile of the editor with like the microest of changes, is just untenable at scale. And if you want me to sacrifice 2% of a project, I would have to earn that much back in development time, and I would only get that back if it took me drastically less time of sitting there waiting for a bar to move between like changing a word or two of code. If I could somehow buy that time back, I'd give them 4%. I don't care. It would just be because I'd be able to get so much more done. So the only thing that would really sell me would be, can I have native support for some kind of hot reloads, or can I turn off or mute things? Can I like structure it in a way where I can have my workflow optimized so that it doesn't, like, God help me, I cannot label an asset. Like I want to label 10 assets. If I label one, it recompiles, and I have to wait till it finishes before I can label the second one. It's insane.
Maybe this is I don't label assets, but I also don't find myself waiting. I've heard some people mention that before, like that they wait around a lot, but I don't find that happens to me often. I'd say maybe in a day it's a total of like 20 minutes, but that's 20 minutes of time spread throughout the day where I'm often doing other things and thinking about what I'm doing at the same time. It's not like a huge thing. It's like I'm switching branches and need to re-import or something. I got to wait 2 minutes, whatever. I'm still thinking through the problem anyway. But is it much bigger of an issue for you?
For me, it's a deal breaker. It's like full on. The amount of times it's like very small iterations on work where I have to tweak certain things, or it's just constant recompiles and various. Like, it's why I don't even use a lot of the recommended assets and plugins. Like, again, I do love things like Odin, and specifically, I want to use Odin Validator. But every time I plug anything else into the editor, I'm just hyper aware of how much longer things take to compile.
Oh yeah, you've got to turn off the auto scan stuff.
Yeah, like I'm gonna say, this is how seriously I take it. When I make a brand new Unity project, I open the text file for the manifest JSON and I delete everything, which means I don't even have colliders, I don't have audio sources. I wipe everything and I add them back as errors crop up from the assets I install or a feature I want to use. So I wipe everything from my Unity project when I begin. And yeah, everything you add again starts to slow things down, and it just becomes too much. And a lot of it, because again, I go back to my job is 90% code. Yes, I'll be tweaking some stuff visually, but the fact that I'm writing code and most of my time is spent staring at an editor with a bar in the middle is just mind-boggling to me, which is going back to what I used to say 2 years ago, which is why I write so much of my code sidecard in a DLL, and I have it automatically MS build into the project because I just can't stand it.
Do you use hot reload?
Again, I have, ever since your recommendation, I bought it, but it doesn't fix the kind of issues I have because, again, I write systems more so than anything else, so I'm not making the kinds of small tweaks that'll be supported by that. I'm very much rewrite things as like systemic stuff that automates and loads from files, and so I'll modify how the loader works. I won't be like modifying a variable in a script or something,
I take Jason's issue, and my issue is when you hit play mode. There are some things you can add to a project that make play mode or hitting the button very, very painful. Entering and exiting. These can be two major pain points because a lot of my work is usually in like, oh, I want to create like an art scene here, or I want to like record a bit of footage here. The post-processing volume adds after play mode hits, it then locks for 10 seconds. for no discernible reason other than the volume being enabled in this particular project. And that actually makes me think very bad thoughts, and it makes me not want to do my work. It's that and things that add up over time that then make the process like kind of more and more deteriorous. I had to abandon, and this is a video I wanted to make that's been painful to even make the video on, my old version of my virtual production system, because there was a bug. I can't tell how it was even introduced, but it made the process of entering play mode 10 minutes, like by total. And I had a older version, and I cannot tell you truly, because I dissected for every package, every code diff, what has now what tripped that. But it was a wake-up call for me for this is way too bloated. This is it's not working for me. It's too painful to actually use. I have to
even like,
did you profile the editor?
Yeah, well, it's locking as it tries to enter play mode. So the profiler, well, it's on the green bar, so the profiler is not even tracking that. It's just
no, but if you launch the profiler as the standalone version and then run it against the editor, it should show you. I mean, it'll take a while, but when that frame completes, it should show you where it's sitting. It's probably sitting in one stupid method.
Yeah, it was one stupid method, or it was something. But I tried. Also, I think we're about a year out now, so I actually forgot. I started fresh, and it's been better starting fresh. But it's still micro things like this that harm and slow down the general like play process, where it's death by 1,000 cuts that just lead it into more and more general like instability. I don't like that. Enter play and exit play needs to be smoother.
And like, there's so many like little things that. It's just from a usability standpoint drive me insane. One of the simplest ones is when I open the package manager, why does it not just show me the packages I've installed? Do not do any web API calls. Just show me the things that I always use because I've already downloaded them, and give me an option to click 5 and click go, rather than go open, wait for load, click 1, wait for load, install it, wait for load. Now I can click the second one, which is again why I don't do any of that. I don't even use their own package manager. I open the text file. I have an existing text file I use with all the names already written, and I copy in the ones I want, or I automate that if I want to, because it's faster than their own tools to make it easier. Like, all of this stuff is simple usability 101. Just cache the stuff that's used, show that as my first option. Why is that not a default? Oh, and one other thing too, very small thing, but I would also pay for this as a feature. There is no way in Unity to build a installer executable. Now, you can do it using a whole series of like third parties, like Install, Shield, Wizard, and a bunch of other stuff. But if you do, you're going to constantly hit Windows licensing signed issue, and then it basically looks really scary to non-programmers because it comes up with the, oh my god, it's a warning, I don't know what this is. And as someone who does a lot of client work, anytime I build a Unity project, I cannot give them a nice friendly installer, because if I do, it makes Windows think it's a virus visually, and then clients are afraid to install it or demo it or try it out. So a first-party solution to build a thing you click, which installs it on your machine and puts it in the program files and stuff. Again, I can do all of this myself, but if I do, Windows will shout at me. I need Unity to have a conversation with Microsoft and make that okay, where they have a signing system where I can like sign it with my name or my ID or something, just so I can make installers that work without panic attacks on Windows side.
Yeah, I think that's good advice.
That might be niche though. That might be something not other people want. But for me, like, the amount of times I see people scared when they install something in Unity and it comes up with the warning, we don't know where this came from. It's like, I don't know what to do with that.
I would really love a deployment system from Unity where you could just push out games, sell them, make them free, and apps and stuff, and then have it do the security scanning. What's up, Corvallis?
All right, just I +1 to that. Okay, having an installer pipeline would be great, especially because you might want to build a non-specific game application with Unity. Unity kind of encourages that with the way the engine is set up. There's some things I'm like, oh yeah, this would be excellent if I can make it like a portable, movable MSI installer. Which is funny because I thought they bought Ironforge, which was. No, I'm not going to speak on that. I can't even remember. It's too long ago. But I was going to try to draw a point there, but it's like my memory's too fuzzy. But yeah, like having an installer solution would be very nice rather than having to exit to different build platforms around your Unity game to make that work.
Yeah. Oh, and there's this one solution of just using ECS. My solution for the package manager, by the way, Story, is just throw a shitload of RAM at it, open up that window in a tab, and just leave it open all the time, and then just never close projects.
How much RAM do you throw at it? How much RAM do you have?
128.
So do I. I have 128 and it's still slow for me. That's my point. That
It means you need more. It means you just need
Just more
256. You've hit the limit.
Yeah.
Your RAM needs to do squad store. It needs to be stronger.
I did a test. I think I mentioned before. I wrote like 6 million entries into a text file and it took me 4 seconds, just out of curiosity. And that's faster than it takes to open up the package manager in Unity. That shouldn't be the case.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's nuts.
Yeah. I would add to all because the compilation, play mode, package manager. I would agree on that. I would add rendering pipeline, single rendering pipeline that you can just change on the fly.
I knew
which
you'd say that. I knew you'd be pick one, make my life easier. I knew you'd say that.
And some better light mapping. Yeah. And for me, the most important thing, stability. That from one version to a second minute version doesn't break anything.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a big problem. With the preview version, I think right now it's... Let me check, because I have Hub open on which version we are in 6. Yeah, 6.11. 6 version Unity 6.9 F1 broke all our demo scenes in all of our assets. All of them didn't work. So this version just was not usable. So
Yeah, stability is something I've heard from a lot of people too. It's like I haven't heard many people complain about performance, but I have heard a lot of people with stability. This is good though, hearing people actually having performance issues, because it's one of the few things that like I feel like other people say, and then I just never run into it. But maybe it's just the projects too, and the setup. Story on that topic, actually, if you don't mind, on the projects where you're seeing stuff just generally being slow, where you write code and then you've got to wait for a bar every time. Are these like, what's the scale and scope of these projects? I'm kind of curious. And can you just tell everybody what your hardware is for reference too, so they know you're not running on like an old Celeron?
That's a good question. I can pull up my my control panel here. It's not like the most brand new machine in the world, but it's not exactly
128.
Not like it's an i3.
It is a Ryzen 9 3950X 16 core with 128 gig of RAM, and of course I have my 2080 Ti. I think is my graphics card at the moment. Although I have a 3080 Ti in a box beside me that I keep meaning to do something with. Yeah, it's so the problem for me. I guess this is more philosophically. It's not so much slow or fast as a like broad state, because that doesn't mean anything, right? What it means is like, how much does it impact your ability to get work done? And the fact is, I'm working in text 99% of the time. And what I'm checking is, did the text I write result in the number I expect? That is the majority of my job.
What's like an example that can you like a use case example where you write code, you jump back into the editor, and then you're waiting a long period of time? Like, what's one of the changes? Like just a simple one.
One of the a client project I was working on recently, I built my own little state machine. Very simple. It was just a enter and exit with a coroutine runner, and it would basically say when you exit one state, it coroutines the exit of the last one, coroutines the enter of the next one, runs the state, and blah blah blah. And so yes, I can manage this stuff externally, but like I'm writing. There's a lot of event stuff going on, and it's a client app which has like it pauses for inputs and uses the like wait until certain inputs are hit or whatever. So I have to add another screen to this application. So I open the thing, I write a script, I basically write, I have a base state, and I just write hello world and create a canvas, and I have the canvas show on the show. And now I press play, and I have to wait until Unity compiles my script, builds the thing, starts it, resets, reloads the domain, press play, loads the scene, gets into the thing, and I can then finally press the one button that jumps to the screen that I want to get to. Now, again, for you might be like, well, that's how it works. And I'm like, yeah, but 99% of my stuff is just, can I not just test that I write a piece of code and it was the name of the state is this, I press button, name of state is this. I don't need to.
So the turnaround time though on this, what are we looking at? Like, is this still just like it's a matter of seconds, but it's adding up because you're doing it repetitively? Or are you looking at like you did that and then you're waiting 1 to 2 minutes for it to start?
Maybe a minute. I mean, again, I don't benchmark too much of that stuff because what I do, again, I get so frustrated. I literally close Unity, I open Writer, I make a DLL, I write all of the code there, and then I have a MS build process that drops it into Unity, and I have Unity open then on a second tab, and then Unity can rebuild in its own slow pace it wants to while I work on code that I can test. And then when I really have to test the visuals, I'll then click Unity and run it. I just don't have the patience to sit and wait for Unity to like recompile every time I decide to like move a number a bit. Yeah.
So getting it to a point that was fast enough for, I guess what I'm trying to tease out is for it to be fast enough for you to care, you would really have to remove that startup of Unity and that compilation step from the process and be more like live web development where you go in and you change stuff and you don't even have to
it doesn't have to be
right? Where along that would it actually matter to you?
Well, for me, it's not a matter of individual thing. It's more use case. It's that I'm aware, having done this enough, that there's different people who use the system for different things. There's people who are trying to tweak prefabs. There's people who are trying to place art assets. There are people who are trying to write code. There are people who are trying to fix copy in text. And every one of these people is all beholden to, no matter what it is you're doing, you have to wait for Unity to finish to let you look at whatever it is you did. And I think a smart system would be one that would be aware of what you're doing and separate those out, which is why I'm such a big proponent of middleware. Because, for example, if I'm an audio person working on a project and I'm using Fmod, I don't have to wait for anything external to recompile to play with my sounds. And in fact, I can run it in parallel as Unity's running, and I can tweak the balance and levels of songs. And when I stop playing, it's already done. So I can run Unity and I can tweak and add sounds and modify it in Fmod in parallel. And as a programmer, I don't have those kinds of tools because no matter how much I try to like parallelize my work, it's very slow. And I'm not saying programming is obviously harder because it has to literally recompile the system. But because Unity does so much smart stuff with like, well, there's editor builds, then it's custom builds for this, and you have your preprocessor directives. My point is, a lot of the time I'm testing one thing or one case. If there is a way to go, look, I'm just testing code here. Can we disable these 4 or 5 startup routines of stuff that I'm not using right now? Or don't build these parts, or don't, like, I don't know how they would structure it on their side. But the fact is, all I'm saying is the workflow itself is so tedious in places that it doesn't need to be, that's the only thing that would make it really beneficial for me, is if I could work in a way which is faster and that I would allow me to isolate one job at a time and like run like if I could run unit tests in Unity without running the engine up every time, that would be golden for me. If I could just run like a micro process that all it does is run the C# compiler, loads their DLL and runs just the portion of my code without running the engine, the profile, the whatever, the, you know, running the editor and stuff. Because for that one moment when I'm just testing, I wrote a new shop function and I want to check the price. Doesn't let you buy it if you don't have enough money in your wallet. I don't need the entire engine to run the graphic side when I test that number. And there's no way for me to do these micro things if I live in Unity world. That to me is what I
Why can't you just write a unit test for that though and run it in Writer?
Well, I can, but if I do it through Unity, and like if I use Unity's test runner, for example, I'm still waiting a day for it to open up the thing. But that's why I do it. Like I said, I don't use Unity for that because I can't. Even if I use Unity's test runner, it'll rebuild the entire domain of Unity to test did that number change. That's what I mean.
Those are good points as you're doing like you're doing structure, like you're doing modules or different like workspaces for different things. Like I don't know if you guys ever use Xcode, but iOS development works like that. So you can preview stuff without running it. You can check values like they're like almost like hot reloaded live breakpoints without running the code. So your output is in a separate column, just text output of whatever methods or whatever code you're running. And you can run tests without building. So you've got 4 different pipelines to choose from, and only one of them actually runs the build, which is crazy. But you're totally right. Like that would help so much if we had parallel processes where we could pick and choose what was being like put together and run and when.
Yeah, the question is, what's worth my 4% or 2%, whatever? That's worth 4% to me by a large margin.
What would that workflow actually look like to be worth that 2%? Like, what is it? So, say you're working on this state machine system. How is it different in the this is worth 2.5% version? What is that? What is the actual difference in that flow?
Well, the idealized version would be, anyone who remembers NCrunch, it would be a parallel test runner that has a screen up with green lights, and I can test that things work as I expect them to while I type code. But I wouldn't even request that. That would be a dream, but that's not what I would expect. The next level of that would just be to have, it's similar to how Writer does their test runner, where I write code, I click save runs a process build, it doesn't freeze, it doesn't put a text box and stop me engaging with the system for the duration of the build. I can still keep going, and then when I'm done, underneath it turns red or green the bits that did or didn't work, and I can go, oh, that one failed, go back up 3 lines, change a thing, press save, and go back down and keep going. So my actual typing and workflow is never paused, but the tests and verifications can happen in parallel. As it is in Unity, if I type and want to test something, I end up having to do a full build cycle. And this gets even worse when I'm using VR. So I'm using VR, my workflow requires write the code, run the thing, build the app, put on the headset, step out of my seat, push the chair to the side, grab the controllers. And that's not Unity's fault, but my point is these are all friction points that make more and more time to test the most basic of things.
But so far, I mean, it just sounds like unit testing.
Well, I'm using unit testing as an example, but like my point is, okay, forget unit testing is one thing. What if you are, like I said, if I just want to tidy my folder, if I want to tidy the Unity project folder, and I said, I'm just going to move some files around, nudge something, change the name of directories, move all this stuff, just try that right now. And you'll see how long it takes you, because every move.
Right. But I wouldn't pay 2.5% to move it faster, because I would just move it and then I would move on to my other tab and continue with whatever else I was doing.
You're thinking about it in terms of one thing. I'm saying that the world, when you work at anything, your world is split up into modes of work, flows in what you're doing. And there's very discrete, obvious things you do. You're in a concept art phase, you're in an organizing project phase, you're in a writing code phase, you're in a customizing art phase. And my point is the engine treats all of them the exact same. I'm not paying the 2% for one thing. I'm paying the 2% that each piece could be done where only the bits needed for that runs, and the exponential saves would be uncountable. That you could basically say, I just want to tidy my folder. That'll be done quicker, so I don't have to wait for every single thing to build. Or I want to write code. I can do that and write my tests, and I don't have to worry about graphics. Okay, now I'm going to do the UI stuff. I'm not going to be recompiling code at all, so that won't change. But now I can modify the position of the scriptable objects and things, and it won't.
But what can't you do? I guess on that last part, what can't you do now that would change? What's the part that you're seeing different in that flow? So you're modifying
in that flow, I have to go in and turn on or off my domain reloading when I'm switching to those different modes.
Why?
Again, it's a small thing. Because if I don't have it on and I have statics in my code, it's going to then retain state. So I obviously need to, and unless I want to hook into that myself and write it. So again,
but I just never turn it off, I guess.
Yeah, but do you use a lot of static objects in your code?
No.
Yeah, but I would. So that's a feature I would want, right? And so,
but I also I force it to domain reload every time. Sorry, I mean I don't disable the domain reload because I just don't trust it.
That's impossible.
I don't trust it not to break stuff.
I cannot live with domain reload on. It's so slow. It's just for a single test. That's insane to me. No, I don't know how you do that. So there we go. That's the difference. If you think it's fine when you press play and it reloads domain, you and I have a different concept of speed and expectations. That's it locked in a sentence right there.
But when I press play, it doesn't take a long time.
What's a long time to you?
More than 2 seconds. It takes like 1 second, 2 seconds.
But think about what that means. If I'm using Unity and I want to nudge, I would say, actually, I don't like where the health bar is. I'm going to nudge it 5 pixels up and I press play. Why in God's name am I waiting 2 seconds for that?
Stop playing. I would do it while I was playing, figure out the correct position, stop playing, and then put it for a second. Okay. Sorry, what'd you say?
No, yeah, it
was my internet dropped out. I was saying.
Did he start? Hello? Are you with us, Jason?
No, I think he disappeared.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
My internet is
same thing. I was just saying
acting up.
To me, that's untenable. And yes, I know you're saying that you just wouldn't stop playing, but you're finding workarounds and then justifying those for the core. What I'm saying is there is no universe where I am working on a project and I move an image a couple of pixels up and I have to wait 2 seconds. That to me is insane in any circumstance.
Right, but I don't wait 2 seconds. If I'm moving a pixel up, I'm either in prefab edit mode, moving stuff around, or I'm in play mode, moving things around, getting them exactly where I want them, and then just saving that off and pasting it afterwards, which is slightly pain in the ass process, but it's not, I mean, it's a couple seconds. It's not anything difficult, and it's way easier than trying to do it and then press play and see what it looked like. I mean, it's essentially as close to doing it live with CSS editing of just moving and dragging shit around and then keeping that data or keeping the saved positions and offsets. I mean, is that not how everybody does it? Like if you wanted to go rearrange something in your UI, are you not just opening up like your UI scene or your UI prefab, moving it around? Or if you want to do it at runtime because it's slightly different, you're not just going in there like at runtime, figuring out the new value and then just dropping that onto the prefab. So you just like open up the prefab, go paste in the modified one while you're still playing.
I don't know if I'm just like, were you just given a special build of Unity where everyone else in the world I've talked to is familiar with the idea that even if you look away from your screen, Unity will try to sneak in a recompile when you're not looking. Like that's my experience. Everyone I've talked to, I don't know where you're getting this version of Unity, which is like it's fine, it's not slow. To me, if I so much as like if I remind Unity it exists, it'll reload. Like it doesn't need to do anything. Never mind all of this other stuff I'm talking about.
Yeah, the same.
It could be, as like a hypothetical, it could be a version of Unity difference where maybe if you only work in like newer versions of Unity, it could be more streamlined. So one of my projects is like in 2021 that I just opened up just to click around in. And when I make a change, I notice I make the change, it gives a brief bar that I can move again, and then the domain reload happens, and then that is like a multi-second process. So it breaks it up a bit, but that's like a 2021 project I decided to open up and profile test. And like profile looking into it, the two biggest hangs it has, one of them is the plastic SEM UI editor reload, which I have no idea why that's even happening. The window is not even open, but that is somehow dragging my
There's an update.
So I'm a little annoyed.
They have a new beta version of it that fixes all of that. Apparently that plugin was pretty buggy and caused all kinds of problems like that. And I think it just came out like in the last couple of days.
My problems with Unity. Unity magically solved all my problems in a couple of days. I'm gonna have another one of those moments. Oh yeah, I'll try to update into that. But yeah, that's apparently caused a couple of good seconds before I can actually do anything, even when hitting play mode or on any form of update. But yeah, I think it might be an editor thing or like a Unity version thing. But yeah, just in general,
I think Jason has just been so. And I think this is some Stockholm syndrome poor Jason has here. I think you've been working in Unity so long that your benchmarks are completely changed. Because if you work in other areas, if you work in web stuff, if you work in even just .NET development, there is still load times, of course. But like Go is so fast. Disproportionate is by such a wide margin that it's not even funny. And like for me, it's not about like boredom or time. Like there's been so many studies on this in that the way time extends. If the editor compiles for like I think it's something like 23 seconds, some crazy number, I can't remember the exact one offhand. If it's less than X amount of time, you'll stay there and wait for it. If it's any longer by like a second or two, you'll be bored enough that you'll do something else, like you'll open up a browser tab or you'll check your mail, and that will take longer than whatever the remaining duration of time is. And so the act of something taking 23 seconds to 24 isn't actually 1 second, it's a minute, because the time it takes has now moved your attention to something else, which opens up another thing where you do that for a minute and a half and you come back. And you don't think of it that way, but that has now stolen more of your time because its pauses and durations modifies your behavior in such a way that causes you to do something else or go somewhere else or get distracted or whatever. And so like there's so many studies on time and attention, and if you have ADHD or something similar, even worse, and you're sitting there going, I do not have the patience to wait for these like little ticks and timers. And when every single action in Unity takes a minute or two, this is what I mean by adds up. Like half my day feels like it's loading bars. It may not be literally half the day, but I'm losing at least an additional hour on top of the loading just by me wandering off or doing something because I'm like, I'm not going to sit. I'm going to make another coffee while I wait, or I'm going to go do this. When I work in pure code, I can work for 7 hours and never leave my desk because I'm constantly typing. And I'm never needing to not do that because nothing's stopping me under any point, you know?
Yeah. Dom made a very good point, too. It could also just be related to the fact that Rider is automatically kicking off the builds when I save every time. And I also have a habit of, I don't actually save. I hit Control-Shift-B. So every time I modify a file, I just start a build in Rider and it kicks it off. And maybe that's why I just click over and it just automatically works and it's always running. And that is definitely like my workflow and my habit. I'm in Rider, I write code, if I'm doing anything that actually needs me to do a build, I'll do a build. Otherwise, if I'm not, I just have hot reload up and I just go in there and change the shit live, and it just works for, I'd say 75% of stuff. Whenever I'm adding new systems and stuff, obviously it doesn't, but going in and debugging anybody else's code.
That's a video request from me. Make a video for an hour where you just code, and I just want to see what this magical world looks like, where it doesn't feel like I'm living in Walls time, or, you know.
Yeah, and a lot of it too, was on the hot reload part specifically, is less writing new code and more going through and modifying, fixing other people's existing code that's there. It's not so much adding new systems; it's figuring out what things are doing, and then writing the code to make it work right, and then knowing for sure that it works right without having to stop and go back in, because that is obviously with the game. There's a process of going through all the setup and getting in, and either that or making something to shortcut it, which is also pretty important to do eventually. Anyway, it's interesting. This is really good insight, because it's a perspective that's different than mine, and I like to hear that.
Well, it's also like I've researched these topics for different reasons, like unrelated to Unity. I like making good stuff, and so I've researched things like, how do you do search engines, how do you do caches, what's a good way to do it, and how do you do file ingest systems. And a lot of it comes down to things like having a drop file location where files get added, it starts parallel queues, stuff gets loaded and built in parallel while you're working. And Unity's entire workflow really does feel like it's just this constant pausing of do stuff, stop, reset everything, go again. And the idea is that so much of what we're doing is actually micro domain changes. In a large project, over the day, you might affect 4 scripts or 10 scripts, and you might affect 20 assets. Like if you're sitting there tweaking a lot of, because you're usually solving one problem, you're building a new enemy, or you're doing a level or something. And the fact that it feels like the entire project is in a perpetual state of like flush and reload is just insane. Like it just doesn't, and even go back to the simple things like the package manager. If I want to add a new package to the project, why do I have to start loading websites to load the package manager, to search for updates for versions, to read these, when all I want to do is just see, hey, is that thing available that I used last time? Or like, why is there not a button for me to, like, I only have a certain amount of assets. And yes, I do buy probably more than most people. But why is there not a button to say download my asset history once as a file and put it in my goddamn computer? And then I don't need to reload my asset folder every time from the web, every time. That's one file. It would be a couple of megabytes, and they would never, ever again have to load a single thing to view my asset history. And there'd be an update button I could hit once every couple of days to add the new assets I might have added. That would save tons of time for one problem. And I'm saying that principle across the board, how many things in Unity do they actually already have the answer to, or already know, or is already built, but their go-to solution is, screw it, we'll wipe the whole lot and start again, because it is easier. It does rely, things like the domain reloading, it solves the problem. It just goes, wish, okay, guaranteed to be safe because we wiped the lot and started again. It's the same as like reloading your scene, going, I don't know what the problem is, I don't know how to fix state, I'll just reload the scene, it's fine. The entire engine's philosophy is that. That is what I'm paying for. What I would pay that percent for is a philosophy of design, which is around understanding state, context, and build things so that I can live and work in microcosms of things that are faster. Not just this blanket solution of it'll work if I reload it and wipe the whole lot. That's the bit. That's the single thing I need,
Wouldn't assembly definitions help with I changed something in this one script and it's rebuilding the whole project problem?
I do some of that, but again, we go back to the other problem. Because of Unity's design philosophy around packages are dropped wherever the asset creator drops them, which means you can't control that. And Unity's package system supports having editor and runtime stuff in the same package, which means if you try to do your own package manager, you have to tease out the 2 folder differences between the editor side and the runtime side to build 2 separate assembly definitions to manage those separately. Why am I doing all of this when the assets separately should have these as separate things? Why isn't, when I download an asset from third party, does it not drop it into third-party runtime, third-party editor, automatically have an assembly definition and let me have 2 assembly definitions, things I've added that are not mine, things I've added that are mine? That should be automatic. And if I want to tweak it further, I should. But as it stands, even adding third-party packages is a nightmare, and it bloats your project. And so again, my first video on my YouTube channel is how to do exactly that, how to use assembly definitions. So very clearly, it's something I think about. But even that solution is a nightmare and like a hack on a hack on a hack, right? It's not first party.
I'll even say, as someone who watched that video and now does exactly that, all of it by hand, the upfront cost of even triggering domain reload is still high. Using assembly definitions will chop it down from being egregious, but if domain reload triggers in the first place, even with everything definitioned, partitioned out, Domain reload, startup, and exit are like the two biggest chunks of that. Bad definitions will multiply this. Good definitions don't remove the initial start and stop of even entering.
Also, and like without going to a whole other thing, why is it that when I download an asset, the assets, like if I was an asset developer, why can't I define very simple preprocessor directives that are on my asset so that as I'm a third party who wants to integrate with my stuff or build my own packages, why can't I demarcate, use this if DoTween exists, use this if package name X exists, and I could write my code cleanly so it supports it. You can do it with some of Unity's built-in stuff, and you can write your own preprocessor directives, but you're now managing another system on top of a system to write your own dependency injector stuff, when every package theoretically could have its own code, which could need to be part of some kind of package definition. So out of the box, it should automatically say developer name _ asset as a preprocessor directive that I could or could not include in my code. That would be free, instant, and you'd be able to write tons of code that would be automatically gated based on whether you want to include an asset or not. Again, these are all downstream problems that off the top of my head, if someone sits down to do an engine, I'm sure they can come up with more solutions than this. And all of this is just about micro time saves, which sound very pedantic, but at scale, they're not. This is like hours and hours of people's lives sitting there waiting for these bloody loader bars. So again, it goes back to your original question. What would I pay 2% for? That is what I would pay 2% for. That would be like the lifetime of my career as a developer. I would get back years of my life over time. That is worth a few percent, you know?
Oh, that's fair. I mean, I think you're... Go ahead.
I was just going to say that this reminds me of when I used to do DOS programming, and we would use make to, run the compiler and the linker, and it would take 3, 4, 5 minutes. So we'd get up and go to the break room, get coffee when we did a build. And this is on like a 10 megahertz AT computer, right? But then when like the 386s and the Pentiums and stuff came out, all of a sudden it only took like 30 seconds for that make to run, and we didn't have time to go to the break room. So it goes back to your studies about how long people are willing to sit there and wait during a build before they go and do something else.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think Story's right on my... Oh, sorry, I'm lagging terribly. It's my fault. But I would say I think he's right on that bias part, because when I think about it, I get the same kind of stories, Greg. But it's like I think back to building Unreal projects and waiting an hour and a half, and that was the time. So you basically you had some time you had to wait, but you essentially just had to continue working while you were waiting to test things, and you kind of got into that pattern of unless something was. You were waiting for the things you would wait for and actually be stuck waiting for, like server startup. But anything that was long would be so long that if you just got distracted and weren't doing other things, you would be wasting your day. So got into the habit of just coding while it builds and doing other things. If I tab over and it's doing something else, I'm jumping back into the code and writing the next part and just continuing on. So it probably is a little bit of a bias there, Story.
Yeah,
right.
Here's a very simple example. The amount of times I hear people look for a file on their computer. I don't look for files on my computer. I use something called Search Everything that builds an entire index of my entire computer. And if I want to find any file in any folder anywhere in my computer, I can do it in less than 4 characters. The idea to me that people are going, nested folder and structured. Sure, you can do that. If that's what your baseline is, then something only taking 4 seconds might be great. But for me, I'm living in a world where I'm I know how fast this can be. I don't know why it needs to be, why this can be slower.
When the economy's in seconds, it goes fast. Then every second matters.
I'd pay.
She said, "Hi, little lemon." She's ready to go swimming. So I have to cut out of here in just a minute and get this little one in the pool. You want to say hi? Say time to swim?
Hi. Hi.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
I want the airport.
Yeah, do you all want to go in the pool? It kind of looks like Pal's in the pool. Ice back behind him.
I want the airport.
All right, you want to go in the pool? All right, you want to go play and we'll go jump in the pool in a few minutes? I'll come join you, okay? Ooh, just going to hop down. All right. Anybody you guys got any more on this, or do you want to talk about anything else before we wrap up and go jump in the pool?
I would pay good money to have mono behaviors have constructors. I'm just saying. I don't know how that would work, but I would like that very much. The amount of time spent working around that for silly things just bothers me.
Yeah. That would be super handy. Yeah, a pool outside for sure. It is hot outside. It's like 100 degrees. It's time to go
I am
jump
roasting,
in
so I'm ready
and
to
get
pool
wet.
myself. Look, the cheap man's
Oh,
pool
you have to
is
come
just
over
a
and
cold
swim.
spring.
Oh, yeah, you have to come by
I would add
sometime.
only one last thing. What Jason said: better support for the asset store, so asset publishers can do more things and easier to integrate everything.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it's interesting the perspectives here. It's kind of nice seeing a variety of them. Speaking of the asset store, if everybody didn't already go grab their free Publisher of the Week asset from Powell up there, Nature Manufacturer, go grab it and go check out the other stuff that's 50% off. And then you had, was it one or two things in that flash sale?
One. The
One,
lava.
all right, yeah. So check that out as well. My daughter's back here flipping the light on and off. It's hilarious. I can't stop laughing. And then if you haven't checked out Harrison's book yet, there's the link on Amazon. You can go grab it or go grab it from Pact. I think, you guys, anybody interested in just doing a chapter review? Maybe in the next like 2 weeks from now. Next week I'm going to be gone, so we'll be able to do it. But maybe like 2 weeks from now, we could just go over one of the chapters, just talk about it, and like I said, tear apart Harrison.
Commented it'll be GameDev book
I think it would be kind of fun to defend it.
I'll need to go and like. I'll need to go and have to come up with some arbitrary hot takes. I'm afraid we'll probably agree on 90% of stuff, so it won't be very interesting. I'll have to go find some arbitrary.
You can tell me how it would have been more efficient some other way, because that's something I came across. Like, you bump up against like how much optimization do you want to teach? Because that seems to be counterproductive after a very quick point. Like, that creeps up real quick.
We'll pass around the
premature
optimization.
optimization.
New roast of Harrison.
Yep.
It's interesting. I actually saw this post or thread earlier. I think it was yesterday about premature optimization, but premature. Man, I've totally lost my words. What's that word when you like abstract stuff? Abstraction. Yeah. Premature abstraction being much worse than premature optimization, which I completely agree with, because premature abstraction leads to huge problems, where premature optimization usually just leads to a waste of time because you end up optimizing something that didn't need it. Powell, you shared the Unity Awards. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just some news that Unity Awards are starting, so you can vote on your games. You can have your games nominated for the Unity Awards, the Asset Store packs, or even community spotlights like creators.
All right, cool.
We shall be voting.
Nice. I have to go nominate some stuff. Story, were you going to say something before my internet went to crap and I interrupted you again?
Oh, yeah. I was just saying that my visual metaphor for premature optimization is like, if you're trying to renovate or build a house and you decide to just place a bunch of walls down, because you'll need walls eventually, and then you're basically, even the work of building the house now is going to be impossible because you're having to step around walls you made that serve no purpose in the hopes that you might one day need those walls. One or two might line up with where your new walls should be, but all the other walls are just pointless waste of time. So don't build the things you're not going to use preemptively.
And then how do you get to the?
But if you get all the walls done first, it'll be faster.
Galaxy brain thought. There is a quote, I think, by the Primogen of "Don't get too clever too early," because no one is that smart or that clever. You're trying to solve things in the future before the problem happens. Be a bit more simple. Build it out. Fix the problem as it happens. You can get a little bit better at building in ways that minimize problems, but otherwise you're inventing problems that you're fixing, that you get to have fixes for your invented problems.
Yeah, I've always used the phrase for that one as like earn the solution. is you don't just get to write the solution as if it's correct. You have to first hit the problem and earn it. And once you've realized what the problem is, you're in a good position to know what solutions might work.
Your theory crafting code, don't do it.
Yeah, well, at least don't do it in a project you care about. You do it in the throwaway one where you're experimenting and trying out new ideas and patterns. But don't do it in your work project, because then you're going to have to explain why you got nothing done for 3 months and you have to revert everything that you just tried.
Look, I have this UML diagram and it's theoretically perfect. Did it actually manifest in any code? No. But it's a good diagram.
Yeah, some of my favorite projects started with a giant diagram of how the entire thing is going to work. No idea what the end screen looks like, but we know what the middle looks like in the back end. Doesn't work out well.
This is the dream
anyway,
guys. It'll make the best apps.
I think we're going to wrap it up for here and go jump in the pool. I did forget to share the game architecture course link, so I'll drop that in now. We had the call right before the show, and we'll have another one in 2 weeks, and lessons going over command pattern stuff next. Everybody who's not subscribed, hit the button. And if you're going to join us in the book reviewing stuff, just watch. I'll probably put up the next live stream. It'll be in 2 weeks with a little bit of info on whatever chapter we pick, if we end up picking a chapter, so you can follow along and say which one it's going to be. Any recommendations before we go, Harrison, on what chapter would be good to take as the first one? It would be interesting enough that people would care, but not.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
one you think is best? Not the singleton.
No, not the singleton, but like Builder is fun for Unity because you don't see that a lot, and it's super useful because it abstracts.
Also, it looks nice. It's very visually interesting to look at. Yeah.
Right, it is, but like people forget that like you can do Builder in code and it still works with prefabs and whatever you want.
It's also good for things like randomized stuff, because a lot of people don't realize you can use it to build a lot of prototyping tools with too. So that can be a very
Oh yeah. So that maybe type object is always fun because that's something people get confused with. And we could do command. Command is always a good one. We've got a little the chapter is kind of like it's just like a little turn-based RPG, but it has history mechanics, so you can undo and redo options up to a certain amount. So if you want to
that's
play
a good
like
one,
a tactical game,
we can talk about the simple versions all the way up to like using your own circle buffers to like make it more efficient and stuff. So there's a lot of scope there for that one too.
Yeah, there you go. I don't know. Those were a couple of the ones that got good feedback from people that were already like experienced and were like, oh, this would have been useful if if I had done this when I needed it, when I had the problem. But I mean,
yeah, that sounds fun. Well, let's
are good.
So what you're saying is every single chapter is gold, is basically the point, right?
No, I mean, I wouldn't do service oriented. No, like there's a lot of them that the optimization ones are cool, but they're not super useful right off the bat. So I'd say command, type object, or even state, because state is interesting and it has depth, and everybody uses it.
Yeah, it's the classic creational behavior are the sexy ones. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll pick one in the chat and then we'll update it on the next video, so that way we know about it, and I'll be reading on my flight back and forth this week. So, all right, I guess anybody got any final words before we go?
Like and subscribe.
Yeah, subscribe to everyone and all that. And also, I'll have to pick up the book myself. I have my Remarkable here. I'll pick it up from the digital version for myself.
All right. Well, in 2 weeks.
See you then.
See you.
In 2 weeks. Oh, hold on. Before we go, I have to find the link to share. What happened to my Restream links? There's a link in here to join Jason Story's Discord, and I'm going to find it. Damn it!
If you like me seeing me lose my mind over completely pointless things, I do that a lot over there too. So there's more of that.
There it is. Bam! You know what I need is that picture from your from
Zoom call,
from
yeah.
your Zoom.
Everyone loves
Yes,
that.
I need that there as the image. It would be perfect. Yeah, you got to send that over to me. So yeah, go check that out if you're not already in there as well. And then we'll see you again in 2 weeks, and it should be a fun, interesting discussion on design patterns and other stuff. So all right, see you later, everybody. Bye.